Hi, my name is Damilola, and in this video I'm looking at the topic, where does my help come from? The insufficiency of government. I wonder when you first considered the centrality of government to life. For me, there have been a number of standout incidences. One of these was when I was 5 years old and I was walking out of a plane from the land of my birth, England, to the land of my heritage, Nigeria. And as I stepped out of the plane door, I was enveloped by heat, because that's what greets you when you get to Nigeria. But as I made my way through the city of Lagos en route to my relatives, I was also enveloped by an awareness. And this was that life functioned very differently where I was to how it did where I came from. One of the things that was evident over the course of my stay was that I didn't have to wear a seatbelt. This is one of the more trivial and playful awarenesses that hit me. I didn't have to wear a seatbelt. I most definitely did if my mom was with me, but if she wasn't, it was a bit of a free-for-all. And I hated seatbelts then and I hate them now, so this was good news to my 5-year-old self. On the more terrifying end of things, though, I couldn't work out for the life of me how to make one's way across the road. There didn't seem to be respect for road markings in quite the same way that there had been in London, and drivers seemed to communicate more with their indicators than their horns, the other way around, more with their horns than their indicators, which made for some messy, chaotic, loud trips. So it was very clear to me that things were different. Now, I'm not saying at 5 years old that I went into a deep exploration of the state of the structures of infrastructure or the security of individual rights or institutions, but I was aware that there was something about the government that meant that these places looked as different as they did. Fast forward a few years, as another moment of being like, whoa, this is the role of the state in my life. I was making my way to school as normal with my mom and my sister, mom driving in the front, my sister and I safely tucked in, and the back seat belts on, I'd be glad to let you know. And as we made our way through on the way to school, at one point we get slammed in the back by a motorist out of nowhere. And amidst the shock of the moment, he then scooters off, he reverses and is off on his way. And in the midst of one of the most routine, mundane aspects of our lives, regular thing that we did every day, we were forced from the monotony of the routine into reliance on paramedics and state officers to see us through in that moment, on the police to investigate the situation. And those moments highlighted to me, I guess, my vulnerability in the world. My mom had taken all the precautions that she could, but even those weren't enough to safeguard us, and we needed the state to come through for us in ways that it did in that moment. And I'm super grateful for those instances, and in all the instances in which the government, the role of civil government, has played a role in benefiting and shaping my life and the lives of those around me in society. Government is not just important. In a world as diverse and disordered as ours, it is essential. Now, in considering this topic, I've been led to consider what the purpose of government is beyond individual situations in my life when it's come to the fore. More broadly, what is the purpose of government? And it seems to me that we understand the purpose of government along the discharging of these three functions. Number one, maintaining order. Number two, punishing wrong. And number three, supporting human flourishing. Maintaining order, punishing wrong, supporting human flourishing. Now, in one sense, we look to government to help us with these things, and they seem rather straightforward and self-evident. That is until we dig a little bit deeper. And what becomes clear with each of these things is that while there is an intuitive resonance to them, they each are dependent on something outside of themselves to give them meaning. They are each dependent on an external standard, an external structure beyond government to make them useful in the realm sphere of government. What do I mean? Well, let's take maintaining order? Well, in order to have a sense of what it is to maintain order, we have to have a sense of, I guess, who we are as human beings and what our goal as being in society together is. That's what informs what order looks like. So to take a trivial example, if I walk into my kitchen right now with the goal of bringing order to it, maintaining order, achieving a certain goal or function in it, and using order to get me there, well, I need to have clarity on what that goal or function is. So if I squirt ketchup into a bowl and yet I hope for a victorious sponge, that's not going to come out quite like I was hoping for. And I think something similar is at play when we even think of ordering society. We need to have deeper conversations about the kind of society that we long for before we can know how best to order things in order to achieve that. Similarly, when it comes to punishing right and wrong, there are elements of mainstream consensus around what is right and what is wrong in society that the state can come alongside and codify. We see that when it comes to theft, if I steal something that's belonging to my neighbor, that would be just recognized as a wrong thing to do. But not all instances of right and wrong can achieve mainstream consensus. And when that doesn't happen, how do we navigate things going forward? And how can the state be supported in making decisions there? When it comes to tricky subjects like end-of-life care and also assisted dying, how do we decide between giving people autonomy to make their own decisions and also dignifying and respecting, honoring human life and not having the most vulnerable people in our society discarded? You might have a sense of how you would approach that decision personally, but how would you commend that decision to all of society? How should the machinery of state operate when it comes to making that decision? We can certainly have conversations about it, but I would suggest it's not self-evident to everyone in society that we land in quite the same place when it comes to deep moral questions and the likes. What about supporting human flourishing? In some sense, this has the strongest intuitive resonance of all. I want a flourishing life, you want a flourishing life. And of course, the government exists to safeguard some fundamental rights and freedoms for us. And yet, this doesn't always play out in the way that we would think. In fact, sometimes state power can be marshaled in quite nefarious ways. I've been thinking this week about the public figure Aung San Suu Kyi, who was once lauded as a key proponent of human flourishing, seeking democratic rule in her state of what was Burma and now Myanmar. And yet, fast forward a few years, and she's no longer in prison. She is in a position to work out some of the ideals that she has been lauded for, and yet she becomes somewhat in the international community public enemy number one, because it's seen that while she's quite happy to support the flourishing of the people of Myanmar, when it comes to Rohingya Muslims, her standards are somewhat lax, to put it mildly. So we see that supporting human flourishing, as beautiful and as lofty a goal as it sounds, it itself needs an external understanding to give it teeth, that not just some lives are worthy of supporting, but rather all lives are dignified and worthy of supporting. That doesn't just come from a theory of government or a political ideology. To have teeth, that needs to come from elsewhere. And so I have rightly spoken of the ways in which government has helped me, and more broadly helps us in society, helps our society function. But there is also ample opportunity to consider the ways in which government itself is supported by things, external understandings that have a direct impact on the effectiveness and the functioning of government. Government helps us, but government is also helped by particular things. And as I've explored this, it's my conviction that there isn't a singular political ideology or way of dispersing state power or holding power to account that is sufficient to the task of giving us the life that we long for. There are better and worse options, but neither of these things in and of themselves will give us the world that we long for. You see, we often hear it said in the course of day-to-day life, either in the news or out and about on the streets, The government needs to sort this out. The government needs to sort this out. NHS waiting lists are at an all-time high. The government needs to sort this out. We are experiencing strike after strike. The government needs to sort this out. We are failing in our responsibility to steward the environment. The government needs to sort this out. And when we say things like this, there is an element of this being entirely legitimate. We live in a representative democracy, and it's part of how we, the citizens, how we engage with the state, is to hold its power to account. So some of what we see in that statement, in that sentiment, represents an engaged citizenry who are holding state power to account, as they should. But I also wonder if there is something deeper beneath that question, beyond rightly wanting to hold state power to account. I wonder if there is in it also an existential longing for help. Because you see, one of the things that we have, not even just in the outworkings of government, but also in the idea of government, in the notion that there is a government over us, is the idea of there being a power beyond us that we can go to for help. That in the moments in our lives individually or in our communal lives where we come by a problem, that there is a power beyond us with the right resources and the right skills and the right knowledge, where we find ourselves limited, that there is a power in government to take things forward, to be the change that we want to see, to give us a life that we long for. And yes, as we know, and as we have seen somewhat, the government is limited. It's important, it's essential, but it is limited. It's limited in some very fundamental respects. So where do we go from there? Well, there is a passage in the Bible that comes out to play quite a lot over Christmas. And yet, as I consider it in the context of this topic, I'm reminded that, like dogs, the Bible is for life and not just for Christmas. This phrase comes from a book in the Bible called Isaiah, and it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will rest on his shoulders." Now, if you're not familiar with the Bible, or it wasn't your favorite book beforehand, I don't imagine that that sentence has swung it for you, because on face value, it doesn't make any sense. How can something as basic and fundamental to our existence, as essential to society as the government, rest upon the shoulders of a baby? And yet I believe the Bible has caught on to this truth that I've mentioned a moment ago in this sentence, that there is something that we look to in government. There is something that we long for in and through it, that even government isn't sufficient to carry. Even government isn't capable of making good on. But there is one, the Creator God, who is sufficient to carry the weight of government, to carry the weight of our hopes and dreams and the world that we long to see. He does it on the shoulders of a baby, in the person of Jesus Christ. I wonder where in your life you have sought help and yet found it from an unexpected place. And that's some of what we see in this passage. You see, in the doctrine of God, in the nature of God, we know God the Father, who is the power that is able to hold all power to account. And ultimately, he will hold all state power, but also all human individual agents in the world. We will be held to account, measured by the standard of God's righteousness, of his always being right, of his being the perfect contrast to our wrong. But God doesn't just sit above us as the perfect political power and lawgiver. No, in Jesus, he comes to us. And Jesus takes on the weight of all that we have done wrong in this world individually and corporately. He takes it onto his shoulders. He bears it on himself in the cross. But also in the midst of that, he shows us what it is to fully be alive, to live the life that we long for in relationship with God, where not just our external world is ordered, but internally we are free from the dysfunction that plagues the world around us, but also that plagues us, that stops this world from being the world that we long for, that means that we are so dependent on government to live well in this world. And in the person of the Spirit, the life of God comes to live in us, helping us to live out this new reality. And in the person of Jesus, that which government is incapable of doing is supported in this God who is able to hold all of the world together. Now, a good thing that I hope that you are considering and will go on to consider beyond this is, what supports state power? What are the institutions? What are the fundamental understandings that legitimize the rightful exercise of state power? Where does the state go for help? Where does the help of the state come from? I would love you to consider this question politically. But if I may, I'd also like to invite you to consider it personally. Where does your help come from? As you navigate day-to-day life, and as you from time to time are faced with your vulnerability in this big world where sometimes, regardless of the precautions that you take or how careful you are, you're visited by tragedy. In this world in which you long to see the world made right beyond you, but you struggle to make your own world right, your own internal world right. Where does your help come from? And there is a passage in the Bible that's inspired this opening part to the topic of this talk. It's a psalm in the Bible, which is a work of poetry right at the center of the biblical text. And in the context for this psalm is that there's a group of pilgrims who are making their way towards the city of Jerusalem, which is the site of their pilgrimage. And as they do this, they have a goal in mind and they're keen to achieve it. But there are some obstacles on the way. And one obstacle is just the fact of the raw elements. They face a scorching sun over them, and so they need to take real precautions to make sure that they can withstand the heat as they make their way. But there's also vulnerability to bandits, that there isn't quite the security that we know and in part take for granted in our present experience in this nation. They can't quite call on law enforcement to help them if something goes wrong in the way that we can. They're not functioning on well-lit roads that help them make their journey in peace. There are so many things that they are vulnerable to as they make this journey. And so there is the question in the first verse, I look up to the mountains that are on the horizon in Jerusalem surrounded by mountains. Does my help come from there? And in one sense, like we've arrived at with government, yes, help will come to them once they get to the mountains. The mountains are more secure as a shelter than the plains of the valleys that they are navigating. In one sense, their help does come from the mountains. But actually, within this psalm, that question is answered differently. I'd love to read it out to you as it progresses. I look up to the mountains. Does my help come from there? No. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let you stumble. The one who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel never slumbers or sleeps. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord stands beside you as your protective shade. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon at night. The Lord keeps you safe from all harm and watches over your life. The Lord keeps you as you come and go, both now and forevermore. Civil government is important. In fact, more than important, it is essential to our lives in this world. And it's important that you use your intellect, that I use my vote to participate in our political process, not just for our individual good, but for the good of our society as a whole. But if we are only looking to government to come by the life that we long for, and government will disappoint us at every turn. This psalm locates the help, not just for these pilgrims, but for every human person, regardless of what political regime they live under. This psalm locates their help as coming from the Lord. And I guess I'd love you to consider the invitation of this psalm to know the Lord as your help. Where does your help come from? It can come from the Lord, if only you would accept his offer of help in the person of Jesus, as he longs for you to do.